Good day everyone, I am Via Bicarson and today we will discuss the chapter 14 entitled The Demonstration and Verbal Instructions. So the concept of this topic is an effective methods of providing instructions for helping a person to learn effective motor skills depend on the skills and the instructional goals. So first, I will discuss the application. So if you want to instruct someone about something, how would you do it? So probably you will demonstrate the skills or either tell them how to do it, or you can use the combination of both approaches, which is the demonstration and verbal instructions. Application is the motor skills that might help a person learn through demonstrating them the specific actions for them to cope up. It also includes describing how would you provide them with information about how to perform the skills before they begin practicing the skills. It also explains why things should be presented this way and not in some other way. For example, a PE teacher may demonstrate in the class on how to put in golf. So in order to do that, a teacher must demonstrate the proper movements or give the exact information on how to do it. Same with the baseball coach. He or she may show the player the correct form of bunting the ball. Another is in a rehabilitation center. A therapist will demonstrate on how to button a shirt to a patient. In that way, a patient will easily remember on how to do it. So, lastly is in the aerobic or fitness center. So, the instructor will demonstrate on how to perform the movements to their clients. Same with the yoga instructors. The practitioner demonstrates the skills because he or she believes that in that way the learner will easily learn the information or will easily cope up the things that he or she wants them to learn. But as a practitioner, we must also know our limits as well as the strength and weaknesses of our clients or students kung in order for us to know kung kanusa effective or less effective ang strategies nga ato ang gina-demonstrate for them. And that's the end of my discussion. So the next topic will be discussed with my group mates.
Okay, hello everyone. Good day. This is Kenneth Jambatausa, and I'm gonna continue discussing the topic. Okay. It is ironic that although demonstration is a very common method of providing information about how to perform a skill, there is not as much research related to it as we might expect. However, in recent years, researchers have shown an increased interest in the role of demonstration in motor skill learning. So, for those who don't know what demonstration is, of course, we all know it as doing the actual skill for the learners to learn. Okay, so you're gonna demonstrate the action, do it step by step, and the pattern, and the learners are gonna learn from it. So that's basically demonstration. One reason is the phenomenal growth of interest in the role of vision in skill learning. So the first reason why scientists and other people are starting to study about demonstration is because it's um, the role of vision, no, the your sense of sight, how it contributes or how it helps. Basically, it is one of the components good in learning a skill. So if you're demonstrating, so of course the learners are gonna use their vision. No, they're gonna watch your steps, watch the pattern, and how are you gonna do or how are you gonna act or how are you gonna do the actual skill? Another reason for the current interest is that we know so little about how to effectively implement this very common instructional strategy. So, because of this gap, um, researchers are starting to, study this um, topic, which is the demonstration, because of the gap in knowledge. We have very little knowledge about it, so um, they have to study so that our knowledge, and we can also widen our knowledge about it. And the players, or the the people, especially the coaches of the different sports, it's gonna be useful for their mm, different sports. The terms modeling and observational learning often are used interchangeably with the term demonstration. So modeling and observational learning, this is um, synonymous with demonstration. Modeling is you model, and then the learners are gonna do the act or copy. No, and observational learning, they're gonna observe, and they are gonna observe your actions, the patterns, the movements. No, so this is synonymous with demonstration. But since demonstration is more specific to the context of instruction about how to perform a skill, we will use this term in this text. Okay, so Macaulay, I don't know how to pronounce this. So whatever. So sorry. So Macaulay and Wiss and Macaulay Law and Stemery of 2012 demonstration. According to them, demonstration is more effective under certain circumstances than under others. According to Williams and Hodges of 2005, they question many popular beliefs that influence practice and instruction in the coaching of soccer. So, William and Hodges question these beliefs, no, mga paniniwala about, most especially in the coaching of soccer. So, the first myth is demonstrations are always effective in conveying information to the learner. So, according to them, or kaning nga paniniwala is, lang question why? Because according to them, it's not always effective. No, demonstrations are not always effective in conveying information to the learner. That's according to them. Practitioners should use demonstration only after determining that the instructional situation indeed warrants the use of demonstration rather than some other form of providing information about skill performance. Because there are other skills that doesn't need to be demonstrated. You have to learn it also as well. Not from the demonstration. You have to learn it yourself or any other ways of learning. Okay. What the observer perceives from a demonstration. The decision about the situations in which demonstration would be preferred should be based on our knowledge of what a person actually sees when a skill is demonstrated. Now, note the use of the word sees rather than looks at. So, what you see and what are you looking at is different. Okay, what we see and what we look can be very different, or what we look at can be very different. What we see is what we perceive from what we look at. Okay, so see, what we look at is like the first step. Kumbaga, you look at the action while you see the movements, no, that comprises that action. So see is more on, or more particular, no, more particular siya. Oh, let me just fix this. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, let's continue. Research evidence has shown consistently that the observer perceives from the demonstration information about the coordination pattern of the skill. That's according to Ashford, Bennett, and Davids of 2006, and Horn and Williams of 2004. More specifically, the observer perceives and uses the invariant relative motions that characterize the coordinated movement pattern to develop his or her own movement pattern to perform the skill. So after learning the basic of the skill, they will now incorporate now after like many practices, they will incorporate their own movement pattern. So the style kicks in. It varies from person to person. No, we have different styles of doing skills, so that's what it means. Now, there are two types of research evidence that support this view. One involves the investigation of the visual perception of motion, and the second is the investigation of the influence of demonstration on learning a complex skill. Now, the first one, um, investigation of the visual perception of motion. So it's more on the visual, what you see, okay? What you see, not what you look at. And the investigation of the influence of demonstration of learning a complex skill. Taken together, these two types of research indicate that the visual system automatically detects in a movement pattern invariant information for determining how to produce the observed action in some manner which scientists do not fully understand and continue to debate. The person translates and perceives information into movement commands to produce the action. And I think we're done. So the other reporters are gonna follow. Thank you for listening.
Good day, everyone. So today is I'm gonna continue what they've already discussed. So the vision perception of motion. The vision perception of motion is research investigating the perception of human motion attempts to answer questions about how people recognize movements, patterns they see in their world. So there is a visual perception of motion is an important principles developed from this research is that people rarely use specific characteristics of the people, the individual of component of the pattern to make a judgment about the patterns of this visual perception of motion. So rather, they use a relative information about the relationships among the various components. So using a procedure known as the point light technique, researchers have identified the relative information involved in the visual perception of human movement. So sa paggamit to sa procedure sa known as the point light technique, ang researcher kay nag-identify og information nga na-involve ang visual perception of human movement. Muna siyang point light technique. This procedure involved placing the lights of light reflecting markers on the joints of the person who is then filmed or videotape performing an action or skills. Mauna ninyo makita ang kanang lighting, kanang like na mag-video movie videotape, mga film, mga action or skills na mga drama, makita ninyo ang point light dito kanang gasunod-sunod sa ila like na mag-drama sa stage kana sila mao na siya ang point light kanang gasuga sa ila ha tibali or mao na siya ang point of view sa tuang tan-awon. Then the researchers place the film or video so that a person who watches the film or video sees only the bright dots in motion. So, kung naa ka sa stage, ikaw ang bida, na dito na point ang light sa imo, ikaw rin yun ang tan-awon sa tao. Kaya ikaw man ang motion nga ilang tan-awon. The first reported use this procedure is Johansson in 1973. Showed that the people could accurately label different gain patterns such as walking, running, observing the moving dots pattern. Si Johnson 1973 ang kuan ana siya naka-labeled. So later, the Cutting and Kozlowski 1977 shown that from observing the moving dot pattern, people actually could identify their friends. So, ang kay Cutting and Kozlowski pod is gasyon po dito nga gaka-obserbaran nila dito ang moving dots pattern. Katong light nga ga pasiga sa character. Mao to siya ma-identify nila nga uy mao na siya ang bida. Yan na saya ang point light. So next is in addition, Abernethy and Zawi in 2007 have shown that expert badminton players could predict the direction of an opponent's stroke in advance of racket shuttlecock construct just as well when they view full body videos or point light display. So, ang need daw sa badminton players is dapat whole body ang ilang makita sa ilahang mga opponent. An impressive amount of research has shown that observers are able to detect a range of different movement and range of different movement characteristics based on the point light display. So, sa point light display o point light technique is ma-identify ginila ang motion sa tawo kung naa sa ilahan nakatubang ang light. So, for the review of this research, C. Blake and Schiffer in 2007, using a computer simulation, Hyung Camp 1978 showed that the movement characteristic people use to identify different gain pattern is not any one kinematic variable, but the ratio of the time duration between the forward and return swing of the lower leg. So ang ingon pod ni Hoeng Camp is ni C. Blake and Schiffer is in 2007 is gagamit na sila og simulation. Daghan naman na sa app ang simulation, like tutorial na siya sa YouTube. Napod na siya apps, simulation nga mga apps. So, wala siya. This groundbreaking research on the perception of human movement provided two important conclusions that help our understanding or observational learning. First is, people can recognize different gain patterns accurately and quickly without seeing the entire body or all the limbs move. Ang una daw is, ma-recognize kaya po na to ang movement sa isa ka tao, bahalag dili na to kita ang whole body niya. And second is the most critical information people perceive in order to distinguish one type of gain pattern from another is not only one characteristics of a gain, such as velocity of the human limbs. Instead, people use the invariant relative time relationship between two components of gains. The question is that naturally arise. Then it is if people use relative motion information to recognize movement patterns, is the provision of this source of information is a demonstration that most effective way to bring about changes is coordination. So, you can show this in figure 14.2. A person is performing on the slalom ski simulator. Note that the person has attached lead markers for movement analysis pattern. So, mao na siya ang kwaniya, ang stimulator nga thing kaning naa sa ubos sa tawo. Mao na siya, diha na siya magdihok-dihok. Mao na siya ang controller sa isa ka tao. What movement characteristics change when learners view a skilled demonstration? Having established that perceivers use relative motion to distinguish different patterns of movement, one would expect to see that the learner's pattern of relative motion changes after they have viewed a skilled demonstration. An experiment by Schoenfelder's Zodi in 1992, in which subjects practiced the slalom ski simulator, task shown in figure 14.2, supports this expectation. The simulator consisted of two rigid convex parallel tracks on which the movable platform stood. A participant stood on the platform with both feet and was required to move the platform to the right and then to the left as far as possible, 55 cm to each side, with a rhythmic slalom ski-like movement. That platform was connected on either rubber bands, which ensure that the platform away return to a center or normal position. Mo na siya ang controller. Thus, the participants had to learn to control the platform movement by using smooth ski-like movement, just as he or she would is actually skiing. Participants practiced this skill to several days after they had either observed a skill model performed the task or received verbal information about the goal of the task. So, mao na siya ang explanation about the ski stimulator. So, a kinematic analysis of limb movement shows that the participants who had observed the skilled demonstration developed coordinated movement patterns either in practice that did those who had not observed the demonstration. We can see in figure 14.3 shows one example of this result also in meta-analysis of 64 studies involving a variety of motor skills. So see Ashford and Davis and Bennett in 2006 shows that demonstration convey relative motion requires to approximate model movement behavior. More recent research has shown that the observation of full-body demonstration are not necessary to bring about changes in movement coordination. For example, Horn, Scott, Williams, and Hughes 2005 shows equivalent changes in the pattern of relative motion underlining a soccer chipping skill when learners watch a video display or a point-light display of a skilled performers. Although changes in coordination has been documented following the observation of full-body video demonstration and point-light display, learners do not necessarily need to see a models. Relative motion to produce them. Support for this notion has been provided in an experiment by Hughes, Hayes, and Brislin and Williams in 2005. So, in which participants learned a novel kicking motion that was used by will practice player to scoop a soccer ball over a barrier and onto a target. The participants were shown a point-like display of either the knee, ankle, and two during the kicking task. Just the ankle and foot, or only the two. result indicated that the group receiving only the information about the two more closely matched the pattern of hip-knee coordination used by the model than the group receiving the additional information. So, in this clinical implication of a mirror neuron system is, in a review of mirror neuron research, Pomeroy and colleges in London, England, concluded that the existence of human mirror neuron system in the brain suggests the beneficial use of observation-based therapy for the rehabilitation of upper arm movement in post-stroke patients. The therapy would involve stroke patient observing a healthy person's arm movements during the goal-directed activities. Since that proposal, researchers have reported experiments that have found support for a benefits of observational learning, referred to as action observation by rehabilitation researchers, for improving arm and hand function of stroke patients, especially when combined with regular physical therapy. So, the findings reported by Hughes et al. 2005 are consistent with Latache and Turvey's 1996 claim that people are generally considered about controlling the distal point of the limb during the execution of everyday movement. Hughes, William, Hayes, and Brislin 2007 have provided additional examples of coordination changes inducted by observing the motion of end effectors and consistent with the action effect and constraint action hypothesis introduced in Chapter 9. Have also suggested that demonstration movement effects, example the trajectory of the ball, might be an effective in inducing coordination changes as providing endpoint information in a demonstration. More research is needed to resolve exactly what sources of invariant information should be provided to the learners, and when they should be provided during the learner's process. In the meantime, practitioners should be aware that it is important to consider potential differences in how movement is perceived, recognized, versus how it is controlled, particularly during the early stages of skill acquisition when determining the most appropriate information to provide to learners in the demonstration. That would be all. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am Charlie Galvan. I'm from BPED 2A and this is the continuation of the report. And let's proceed to the influence of skill characteristics. Research has produced equivocal findings about the effectiveness of demonstrations for learning new skills. And this is true guys, because even me, I am more interesting and I can quickly learn or perform the skill, or yes, if na-perform siya, if there are someone who is demonstrating. Some researchers have found out that demonstration leads to better skill learning than other forms of instructions. So also the researcher also ang demonstration jud is ang pinaka-effective, pinaka-legit na way of teaching sa isang kabutang para mas matugan siya. But as Magil and Cohn-Philby-Zodi in 1996 pointed out, a closer inspection of that research leads to the conclusion that the influence of demonstration on skill acquisition depends on characteristics of the skill being learned. So the most important characteristics that determine whether a demonstration will be beneficial is whether the skill being learned requires the acquisition of a new pattern of coordination. We see this clearly when we organize into two categories the results of research investigating the effect of demonstration on the skill learning. In one category are those experiments in which participants learn more quickly after demonstration than after other forms of instruction. Next, the neural basis for observational learning mirror neurons in the brain. In the early 1990s, neuroscientists in Italy, led by Giacomo Rizzolatti, discovered that when monkeys observe another monkey's reach out its arm to grasp something, neurons in the F5 area of the premotor cortex became active. These neurons, known as the mirror neurons, are a specific class of visomotor neurons in the brain, so it can be found in the brain. The important question for understanding the neural basis for observation learning by human is this: does the human brain contain mirror neurons? Several studies have provided evidence that supports mirror-like neurons in the human brain. So for me, it's really visible that we have also these mirror neurons, because we can, even the children, yes, they can imitate the actions or what they can see in their surroundings. And even as if I will see someone like doing something, I can easily copy his or her action. In an early study, a group of neuroscientists in Los Angeles, California, pulled data from 7 fMRI studies in which people observed and imitated simple finger movements. Molnar, Zakas, Ayakabukushi, and Mazzuta, 2005, the researchers noted that during observation, specific areas activated in the inferior frontal gyrus, and that is the IFG, which is in the inferior frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Those two sections of the IFG activated during observations, but during the movement imitation. Subsequent research by Catmore, Walsh, and Hines 2009 showed that theta burst transcranial magnetic stimulation of the IFG, or inferior frontal gyrus, disrupts automatic imitation of finger movement. Interestingly, the inferior frontal gyrus, or IFG, includes the region of the brain known as Broca's area, which is important in speech production. Taken together, this brain activity recording methods indicate the existence of mirror neuron system. So it really nalinational pang brain. Although many questions remain unresolved concerning its specific characteristics and functions. Next is observing skill demonstration. A common guiding principle for demonstrating a skill is that the demonstrator should perform the skill correctly. Why would more accurate demonstration lead to better learning? Two reasons are evident from the research literature. The first reasons follows our discussion of perception of information in the preceding section. If the observer perceives and uses information related to invariant movement patterns, it is illogical to expect the quality of performance resulting from observing a demonstration to be related to the quality of demonstration. So it is very right, because if you observe a movement or action correctly and the performer is performing it correctly, as I am the observer, I can really get the correct actions movement if I will try, because if the performer perform it correctly, I can easily get the movement or catch up the moves. Yes. Another reason is that in addition to picking up coordination information, an observer also perceives information about the strategy used by model to solve the movement problem. Typically, the observer then tries to imitate that strategy on his or her initial attempts at performing the skill. So, mo siya, pagka mag-observe, on the observer, we will try to imitate the actions that is he or she have seen. Yes. So it's really nice if you will copy an action or observe an action if it's really correct, or the performer is really skilled in his or her doings. Novices observing other novices practice. Although the theoretical prediction and empirical evidence indicate that it is preferable for beginners to observe skilled demonstrators, evidence indicates that beginners can derive learning benefits even from observing unskilled demonstrators, especially in both the observers and the models are beginners. What this means is that the models are demonstrators only in that observers are watching them practice. One proposed benefit of using demonstration in this way is that it discourages imitation of skilled models' performance of the skill and encourages the observer to engage in more active problem solving to determine the most effective movement to achieve the action goal of the skill. So also is as I understand this topic, it's also beneficial for observer to observe in not skilled performer, because in that way mas mag-engage ang observer kung saan niya pag-resolve sa problem. If ever nga mag-perform na siya, mag-imitate na siya sa movement or abato niya, mas more engaging yung mind, yung interest, kay syempre ang observer, he or she aims to perform the movement correctly, so he or she will find ways to perform it correctly. So one way to effectively implement this use of demonstration is by pairing students. So pairing students ang isa sa pinaka-effective way nga kaning learning pag-demonstrate. By pairing students, athletes, or patients in a situation where one of the pair performs the skill while the other observes. After certain numbers of trials or amount of time, the pair switches rules on the basis of what we know from research literature. Learning of the skill can be facilitated for both the performer and observer by having the teacher, coach, therapist, or some other knowledgeable person provide verbal feedback to the performer. So, ang isa sa effective way nga magkuhan ani is by pairing students kaning novices observing other novices practice. So isa sa pinaka-effective way nga ibutan is kanang i-pair students at least or na. Then example, ako do mi sa partner and abidwa ka partner, ang classmates na mo. Dayon, they will perform and we will observe as that is instructed by this topic, and when they are given enough time to perform, and yes, we observe their movements, and we will exchange rules, which is we are the performer also and they will the observer. And it is nice to have also daw nga na ay teacher or coach nga magtanaw para if there is something we can improve on ilang masulti for better results of performing. The timing and frequency of demonstrating a skill. One of the reasons for demonstrating a skill is to communicate how to perform the skill. For the beginner, demonstration provides an effective means of communicating the general movement pattern of the action or skill. So demonstrating is a very effective way on relaying a message or relaying the actions to a beginner observer. So yes, it's really nice if you perform it as a performer. You perform it. You spoon feed the message or the task by demonstrating. Communicating the movement pattern of the action or skill. As we discussed in chapter 12, Genta considered this to be the goal of the first stage of learning. So yes, in the first stage of learning, demonstration is very effective. When applied to the use of demonstration, Gentiles view suggest two things. The first is that it is beneficial to demonstrate a skill before the person begins practicing it. And the second is that the instructor should continue demonstrating during the practice as frequently as necessary. So there are two things that is being addressed in this learning. So before a person perform it, he or she needs to observe. Then after the practice, before he or she finally performs the actions. And the second is ang instructor daw is dapat mag-demonstrate japon siya during practice, because even for me also, if I'm practicing right now a movement, and I will copy the movement of my instructor if nga na mag-observe ko. So much better nga also nga mag-practice ko nga demonstrate po si sir or si ma'am para mas makuha na ko ang step by step na actions. Earlier, we pointed out that the skill demonstration communicates the invariant characteristics of a movement patterns, which suggests that more than one observation is essential. If this is the case, then we would expect that the more frequently a beginner observes a skill demonstration, the more opportunity the beginner will have to acquire the movement patterns. So at least two research studies support this latter point. One by Carroll and Bandora 1990 involves the learning of complex movement patterns of computer joystick. The other by Han and Sideway 1993 involves the learning of a golf skill. Both experiments provide evidence that more frequent observation of the model yielded better skill learning. So really, in this topic, it really emphasizes that demonstrating is very effective in relaying a message to a person, and this report will be continued by Beverly Castro. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am Beverly De Castro, and to continue the report about demonstration and verbal instruction, let me present to you the audio modeling. So, auditory models that help us understand the mechanism of the human auditory system. By using digital signal processing algorithms, we model in authority nerves responses of the analyzed and features available with two ears. So this our discussion so far was focused on visual demonstration, but however, there are skills for which visual demonstration is less effective or learning than other forms of demonstration. So so that auditory modeling is more effective accordingly. So an example is a skill for which the goal is to move in a certain criterion. So in auditory, movement, time, or rhythm. These types of skill in auditory modeling is a form of demonstration that seems to work best in auditory modeling, ang movement, time, or rhythm. So, a good research example of the effectiveness of auditory modeling when the goal is specific movement time is an experiment by Bird and Ross 1985. So, accordingly, their task required people to perform a complex sequential movement with one hand in a criterion movement time of 2.1 seconds. So, the visual and auditory demonstration sa ilang research is observed in a videotape of skilled model before each practice trial. The visual demonstration group saw only the video portion of the tape and heard no sound. So, when we say auditory, it is related to the senses of human. Have you remember the five senses, which is the auditory, olfactory, the sense of sight, sense of hearing? But auditory is a sense of hearing. So the auditory demonstration group heard only audio portion of the modeled performance but did not see the model perform the task. So the result of the research indicate that the group that heard the audio portion of the performance did better the visual demonstration. The visual demonstration only group two research examples showing the benefit auditory modeling is learning rhythmic sequence. So as the result of the research of Doddy, Beard, and Dross 1985, so it can indicate that the group that heard the audio portion of the performance did better than a visual demonstration. There are two research examples showing the benefit of auditory modeling for learning rhythmic sequence. This research involves a laboratory task and a sequence of dance steps. So, in an experiment by Voigt and Beekers, 1995, so the people who had no prior dance or music experience learned a sequence of 32 choreographed steps. So, for acquiring the rhythmic timing of the sequence, participants who heard only the timing structure learned it as well as those who both saw and heard the model performance, the sequence. So, therefore, accordingly, that participants who heard and saw the model performance sequence is do better in the research of kining Watts and Beekers. On the other hand, the experiment by Lai, Shia, and Bruckert and Little 2002, in which they found that auditory modeling enhanced the learning of a sequence of 5-time intervals when two keyboard keys were alternately depressed. So before each practice trial, so participant heard a sequence of tones that represent the timing of sequence they were to learn. So, in that way, mas mugana ang auditory modeling. So, how the observing of demonstration influence learning in terms of learning theory? So, an important question is that why does observing demonstration benefit motor skill learning? So, why? Why does observing demonstration maka-benefit sa motor skill learning in order for us to learn about motor skill? So, there are two different views proposed to answer this question. We have here the cognitive mediation theory and dynamic view of modeling. So first, let's introduce the cognitive mediation theory. So, cognitive mediation theory is the predominant view based on the work of Bandura, 1986, concerning about the modeling and social learnings. This view called the cognitive mediation theory. So this theory explains the benefit of demonstration, proposing that when a person observes a skill model, the person translates the observed movement information into the cognitive code that a person stores in the memory and uses when the observer performs the skills. So, got it? The cognitive processing serves as a mediator between the perception of movement information and the performance of skill by establishing a cognitive memory representation between the perception and the action. So according to Bandura, there are 4 sub-processes govern observational learning in this kind of theory. The what we called cognitive mediation theory. So the first is the attention process. So this involves what the person observes and the information he or she extracts from the model's actions. So because of the importance of the attention process for learning, directing full attention to the demonstration rather than the mere observation of it is more important for optimal learning. So it is important, no, the attention process, because it makes you more attentive to adapt the observation and apply it as a motor learning. So the second one, we have there the retention process, in which the person transforms and restructures what he or she observes into a symbolic codes that the person stores in memory. So certain cognitive activities such as rehearsals, labeling, and organization are evolved in the retention process and benefit the development of this representation, the retention process. The retention process. So the behavior production process is the third sub-process. So this behavior production process is the third sub-process. So during this behavior production process, the person translates the memory representation of the modeled action and turns it into physical action. So successful accomplishment of this process requires that the individual possess the physical capability to perform the modeled action. So it is the behavior in which the capability to perform the modeled action. So lastly, we have the motivational process. It involves the incentive or motivation to perform the modeled action. So this process then focused on all those factors that influence a person's motivation to perform. Unless this process is completed, the person will not perform the action. So in this process, the motivational process, it is the process by which you're going to push yourself to perform the specific action. So according to the saying that nobody can push you except yourself, so to do something, so you should push yourself to do the action for your own good. Okay, so what that is the motivation process. So there are some several there are several there are several research studies that have provided support for the cognitive mediation theory by demonstrating evidence that is in line with predictions of the theory. So for example, we have the theory of Shimmery 2000. It provided the support for the prediction that attention is an important process in observational learning. In a series of 4 experiments, participants who had to divide their attention between performing a cognitive secondary task, counting backward by threes, and observing a model did not learn the skill as well as those who did not perform a secondary task. So, in an experiment discussed in Chapter 10 by Smith and Pendleton, 1990, showed that the prevention of the rehearsal process hindered learning a skill. In their experiment, some participants engaged in movement activity during the interval of time between the demonstration of the sequence of movements and their attempts to reproduce those movements. So these participants recalled fewer movements than those who did not engage in activity during the time of interval. So finally, here, the Blandin and Protiu 2000 provided evidence that observational learning involves the development of effective error detection and correction, so which the cognitive mediation theory describes as an important function of memory representation that develops during observational learning. So in 2 experiments prior to observation of a model permitted learner to estimate their errors as effectively as learners who had physical practice the task. So there are several theories that that has the notion about the what we call the cognitive mediation theory. And to answer how the observing of demonstration influence learning, so let's proceed to the second way of answering that question. We have here the dynamic view of modeling. So, dynamic view of modeling is the second view based on the direct perception view of vision proposed many years ago by J.J. Jobson, 1966, 1979. So, Scully and Newell, 1985, adapted Jobson's view to the visual observation of a skill demonstration and proposed the dynamic view of modeling as an alternative to Bandura's theory. So the dynamic view questions the need for the symbolic coding step, so the memory representation step, or the symbolic coding step. So between the observation of the modeled action and the physical performance of that action, instead, it maintains the visual system is capable of automatically processing visual information in such a way that it constrains the motor control system to act according what the visual system depicts. So the visual system picks up from the model salient information that effectively constrain the body and limbs to act in a specific way. Okay? So the person does not need to transform the important received via visual system into cognitive code and store it in memory. This is the case that the visual information directly provides the basis for coordination and control of the various body parts required to produce the action. So the critical need for the observer in the early stage of learning is to observe demonstrations that enable him or her to perceive the important and variant coordination relationships between body parts. So in addition, observations of the model will benefit the learner by helping the person learn to parameterize the action or to express in terms of parameters. So, okay, so which do you think is the correct view between the two? But Unfortunately, there is no conclusive evidence in the research literature that shows one of these two views of modeling effect to be the more valid one. So since they are all theories naman. So as you saw in the discussions of each view, both have research support for some specific assertions. As a result, until we have research evidence that one view cannot explain, we must consider which view is a possible explanation of why modeling benefits skills acquisition. So the cognitive mediation theory has been the more prominent of the two, receiving more attention in motor skill research. However, the dynamic view is growing in popularity. So we cannot conclude who's who's the perfectly correct sa two ka views. So that ends my part of the report. I hope you've got some important information about demonstration and verbal instructions. Thank you.
Good day, ma'am. Good day, classmates. I am Patrick Saralta, and I will be talking about the verbal instructions and cues. So, verbal instructions rank with demonstrations as a commonly used means of communicating to people how to perform the skills, motor skills. The research supports the value of verbal instructions for facilitating skill acquisition. However, it is important to note that several factors are important for developing effective verbal instructions. So, verbal instructions and attention. Giving verbal instructions is that the person has a limited capacity to attend to information. Because of these limitations, practitioners must take into account several characteristics about the instructions they give. The quantity of instructions, we can reasonably expect that a beginner will have difficulty paying attention to more than one or two instructions about what to do, because the beginner will need to divide attention between remembering the instructions and actually performing the skill. A minimal amount of verbal information can exceed the person's attention capacity limits. The instructor should be aware of other important attention-related considerations when giving verbal instructions. Verbal instructions to focus attention on movement outcomes. An important function of instructions is to direct learners' attention to focus on the features of the skill or environmental context that will enhance their performance of the skill. The research evidence based on investigators of the action effect hypothesis by Prinz in 1997, which proposes that actions are best planned and controlled by their intended effects. The hypothesis predicts that actions will be more effective when a person focuses on his or her attention on the intended outcome of the action, rather than on the movement required by the skill. They demonstrated two different ways to give verbal instructions to direct attention to movement outcomes. The first involves instructions presented in a way that establishes a discovery learning acquisition situation. This means that instructions focus the learner's attention on the goal of the skill. Then, as the learner practices the skill, he or she discovers how to move to achieve the goal. The second example involves the use of metaphoric imagery, sometimes called verbal analogies, in instructions which directs the learner's attention to move according to the image, which is the intended movement outcome of the skill. Dynamic view of modeling. A theoretical view explaining the benefit of observing a skilled model demonstrate a skill. It proposes that visual system is capable of automatically processing the observed movement in a way that constrains the motor control system to act accordingly so that the person does not need to engage in cognitive mediation. Verbal analogies. Verbal analogies. Like metaphors, analogies are verbal descriptions designed to highlight the similarities between two things. By highlighting the similarities to something we already know and understand, analogies help us to comprehend something we have not encountered before. For example, we often compare the human brain to a computer to facilitate understanding of how the brain works. Similarly, in the movement domain, we might compare skipping to a bouncy walk to give learners an idea on how to perform the movement without overburdening them with excessive verbal descriptions of how the body parts should move. So the definition of implicit learning, a form of learning that occurs without conscious awareness of what is being learned. Verbal instructions to focus attention on environmental content, regulatory conditions. Another issue associated with attention and the content of instructions relates to the selective attention problem of what in the environment to look for that will help perform a skill. The importance of this issue relates to a critical goal of the initial stage of learning. Accordingly to the Gentiles learning stages model, this goal is to learn the regulatory conditions that direct the movements required to achieve the action goal of the skill. Sometimes we ask people to tell us what they were looking for or looking at when they performed a skill, so that we can help them correct their visual attention focus. However, research investigating the need for conscious awareness of environmental cues when learning skills reveals that people can learn to select relevant cues for the environment without being consciously aware of what those cues are. Verbal instructions influence goal achievement strategies, speed, accuracy, skill instruction. Another factor that we need to consider is that verbal instructions direct the person's attention to a certain performance goals of the skill. A good example of this is the way verbal instructions can bias the strategy a person uses to learn speed accuracy skills. So, the guidelines for using verbal cues for skill instruction and rehabilitation. Cues should be short statements of 1, 2, or 3 words. Cues should relate logically to the aspects of the skill to be prompted by the cues. Cues can prompt a sequence of several movements. Cues should be limited in number. Cue only the most critical elements of performing the skill. Cues can be especially helpful for directing shifts of attention. Cues are effective for prompting a distinct rhythmic structure for a sequence of movements. Cues must be carefully timed so that they serve as prompts and do not interfere with performance. Cues should initially be spoken by the performer. Verbal instructions and cues. Several attention-related factors are important to consider when using verbal instructions to communicate how to perform a motor skill. The amount of information included a verbal instruction should take into account the learner's attention capacity limitations. The second one, according to the action-effect hypothesis, verbal instructions should direct the learner's focus of attention to movement outcomes rather than to the movement themselves. Novice learners can learn invariant environmental context regulatory conditions without conscious awareness of them. Implicit learning. Although attention focus on the environmental context is important, instructions influence the novice learner to the direct attention to certain performance goals, which influences the strategies the learner uses to begin practicing the skill.
Verbal cues. Verbal cues is a short, concise phrases that direct a performer's attention to important environmental regulatory characteristics or that prompt the persons to perform key movement pattern components to the skills. So one of the problems associated with verbal instruction is that the learner can contain too little or too much information that sometimes does not provide a specific information that they must learn to achieve the goal. For example, the cue look at the ball, so the person who receives the information will immediately use visual attention, whereas the cue bend your knee prompts on essential movement component. So, research has shown that short and simple statements is very effective when it comes to verbal instructions in order to facilitate the learning as well as in performing well-learned skills. So, example is ang coaches, ang teacher, ang therapist, maka-implement sila verbal cues in a different way or strategies on how to perform the skills. Verbal cues and demonstration. So one of the best way to accommodate learning is to give verbal cues along with the demonstration to supplement the visual information. So through verbal cues, it directs the attention and can guide rehearsals of the skill a person is learning. For example, a non-soccer player who observes a skill model video demonstration with accompanying verbal and visual cues learn more appropriate form and outcome accuracies than in 5 other practice conditions. The verbal cues presented by audio tape along the video maoy ga-emphasize sa mga specific movements, proper forms, on how to perform the skills while ang katong tao nga nasa video is mo to siya ang ga-demonstrate. We must also remember that visual cues enhance the benefits of verbal cues to make the performance successful. Verbal cues that focus attention while performing. Another way to use verbal cues is to give cues to help learners focus on critical parts of the skills. For example, in an experiment by Master in 1993, first grade classes were taught to do headstands. In some classes, before students made each attempt to swing their legs up into the headstands, the instructor said, "Shoulders over your knuckles," to emphasize the body position critical to performing the skill. The cued students maintained their acquired skills 3 months after practice, whereas students who had not received these verbal cues performed the headstands poorly 3 months later. A similar result occurred in an experiment using verbal cues to emphasize critical parts of the forward rule. Verbal cues as prompts. Performers can use verbal cues while performing to prompt themselves to attend or perform key aspects of the skills. Cotton and London 1994 give an example for an effectiveness of this technique to non-skilled individuals. For example, a university instructor taught the class on how to play the tennis. 5 verbal cues will be said out loud each time they are required to hit the ball. So, silbi ang katong 5 verbal cues is ang mga keyword. First term is ready, to prompt preparation for the upcoming ball. Next is the ball, para ang player is mag-focus siya sa bola. Turn, to prompt proper body formation. Hit, para mag-focus ang player sa pagtira sa bola. And lastly is head down, which prompt stationary position of the head after the ball contact. Verbal cues aid skill performance. So, ang verbal cues is also ginagamit siya to improve the performance or skills of the athletes. For example, London and Herbert 1999 had university female varsity tennis players use self-cueing to help themselves improve their volleying skills. Players learned to say split to cue them to hop to a balanced 2-foot stop that would allow them to move in any direction. Then they said turn to cue them to turn their shoulders and hips to the ball. Finally, they said hit to direct their attention to tracking the ball to the point of contact of the racket and to cue themselves to keep the head still and hit the ball solidly. After practicing this cueing strategy for 5 weeks, the players showed marked improvements both performance and technique. The purpose of verbal cues. Verbal cues can be used in two different purposes. First, the cue directs attention to the environmental event or to specific sources of regulatory information. Example is ready, ball, or hit. Next is the cue prompts action for a specific movements such as head down or sequence of movements or turn. The key of the effectiveness of verbal cues is that as the person practices and continues to use the cues, an association develops between the cue and the act it prompts. The benefit is that the person does not need to give attention to a large number of verbal instructions and can focus attention on the important perpetual and movement components of the skills.